The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical monotone as Megan O'Brien clips her badge to her scrubs, the motion automatic, invisible, the way 1,000 shifts have trained her hands. She doesn't look up when Dr. Pierce passes in the hallway, his shadow crossing the ICU threshold at 6:48 a.m. She simply adjusts the 4-drip-on room for 07 and keeps her face perfectly neutral, the kind of blank that comes from years of practice in places where expressions could get people killed. 3 nurses cluster around the medication cart. The moment Megan approaches, one of them reaches for her coffee cup. Then the second. Then the third. They scatter like startled birds, their shoes clicking rapidly against the polished tile floor. Megan doesn't pause. Doesn't acknowledge the silence that follows. She simply moves to the next room with the fluid precision of someone who has learned that invisibility is sometimes survival. Seattle General's ICU stretches across the 3rd floor in a maze of beeping monitors and the soft hiss of ventilators. The walls are that particular institutional beige that every hospital seems to have copied from every other hospital. The air smells of antiseptic and something underneath, the copper and salt scent of human struggle that no amount of cleaning can fully mask. Megan knows this smell. Knows it from field hospitals in Helmand Province, from tents lit by chemical glow sticks, from 18-hour surgical shifts where the distinction between day and night meant nothing because the wounded never stopped coming. She checks the chart for room for 12. Routine gallbladder surgery scheduled for 9 a.m. Patient name Marcus Webb, 67, Vietnam-era Army medic, admitted yesterday evening for pre-op assessment. 2 daughters, both live out of state. No complications noted. The kind of surgery that happens 200 times a day in hospitals across the country, routine enough that nobody pays attention, which means everything has to be done exactly right. When Marcus Webb shuffles into the pre-op area at 8:15 a.m., he's wearing a hospital gown that doesn't quite fit and an expression that hovers between nervous and resigned. He's the kind of old that comes from a lifetime of hard living, weathered skin, calloused hands, the posture of someone who has learned to make himself smaller in spaces that weren't built for men like him. His eyes are sharp though. The kind of eyes that notice things. The kind that have seen things. Megan enters with the 4-cart, already prepared, 18-gauge needle, tourniquet, saline lock, 3 rolls of medical tape cut to precise lengths. She doesn't introduce herself with the bright cheerfulness that most nurses use. She simply says, "I'm going to get you established before you go back." "Appreciate it," Marcus says, and his voice carries the particular rasp of someone who's been smoking cigarettes since before most people are born. She applies the tourniquet to his left arm with practiced efficiency, her fingers finding the vein without hesitation. Not the median cubital, too visible, too standard. Instead, her fingers track laterally, locating the basilic vein in the inner arm where it runs deeper, where the angle matters more. She positions the needle at approximately 45 degrees, the trajectory angled upward and inward. The insertion point is exactly where a combat medic would choose if they needed an 4 to stay in place through rapid patient movement, through helicopter flights, through the kind of chaos that happens when the human body is broken and you have minutes to get fluids running before the heart stops entirely. The needle slides home. 20 seconds. One smooth motion. The saline flush is clear. Taped down with tape cuts that are identical to 48,000 other tape cuts she's made over the past 8 years of nursing, but placed at angles that a field medic would recognize instantly. Marcus goes very still. She's already moving to the next step, labeling the line, checking the flow rate, documenting the time, when his hand reaches out and catches her wrist. Not aggressively. Gently. But with the kind of certainty that comes from recognizing something you thought you'd never see again. "That's a bagram entry angle," he whispers. Megan's hands don't stop moving. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her breathing stays even. She simply continues with her charting, the pen moving across the pre-op form with absolute steadiness, as if he hasn't just said anything at all. As if those 5 words don't contain an entire universe of recognition she cannot afford to acknowledge. Marcus's eyes are widening. She can feel the exact moment the realization hits him, not just that she's military, but what kind of military. Combat medic, maybe, or trauma surgeon. Someone trained at Bagram Air Base. Someone who learned to insert fours while incoming fire hammered the compound and the medical team worked in the dark because the generators had been hit. Someone who learned that the angle of insertion matters because sometimes you only get one chance and the patient doesn't have time for a second attempt. Your daughters should be here in about 30 minutes, Megan says quietly, her voice perfectly modulated, perfectly professional, the voice of a nurse who has no history beyond the hospital walls. Try to rest before pre-op takes you back. You're going to do fine today. The surgeon is excellent. You'll wake up wondering why you were ever worried. She replaces the 4-cart supplies with mechanical precision, needle box back in the sharps container, unused tape rolls return to their designated slots, tourniquet looped and tucked. By the time she turns back to the doorway, her face shows nothing. No acknowledgement. No recognition. No past. Just a nurse finishing her routine tasks, already mentally tracking the next patient, the next 4, the next vital sign that needs documenting. What Marcus Webb doesn't know, what nobody at Seattle General knows, is that Megan O'Brien has been embedded in this hospital for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. She hasn't been here to heal the sick, though she does that anyway, because the work matters more than the cover. She's here because someone in the Department of Defense got a tip about medical equipment disappearing from supply closures. Surgical instruments. Trauma kits. Diagnostic equipment. Enough inventory leakage to suggest either massive incompetence or deliberate theft. The investigation led here, to Seattle General's ICU, where one particular supply chain manager named Samuel Ortiz had access to everything. Samuel Ortiz. The deaf veteran in room 407. The man nobody on the unit wants to work with because his deafness makes verbal communication harder, and harder communication means missed orders and perceived unreliability. The man whose isolation makes him perfect as a key witness. The man whose complete vulnerability also makes him worth protecting, even if that protection has to come disguised as indifference. Megan moves through the ICU with the kind of efficiency that makes her nearly invisible. She checks Samuel's vitals, pulse steady at 62, blood pressure 118/74, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Good. Stable. The kind of baseline that means he's likely to survive whatever comes next, because in Megan's experience, things always come next. There's always another crisis, another complication, another moment where the careful structure of normal life collapses and what matters is what you do when the lights go out and nobody's watching. She touches the inside of her jacket briefly, a habit so ingrained she barely registers doing it anymore. Her fingers find the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the Special Forces insignia worn smooth from 363 days of contact, the emblem of the only identity that's ever felt real. The patch is from her 3rd deployment. From a year when she stopped counting casualties because the numbers got too large to hold in your mind. From a unit patch that nobody at Seattle General will ever see unless everything goes catastrophically wrong. The morning shift continues. Blood draws. Chart updates. Medication reconciliation. All the invisible work that keeps humans alive in rooms where monitors beep and 4 bags drip and families sit in waiting rooms making deals with God they'll forget about the moment their loved one walks out of the hospital alive. Megan does all of this with the particular grace of someone whose hands have done harder things under worse conditions. But now Marcus Webb knows something. And knowing something in a hospital is like carrying a live wire, dangerous and unstable. He'll think about that bagram entry angle every time he sees her. He'll wonder. He'll probably piece together fragments of truth from the way she moves, the efficiency of her decisions, the absolute steadiness of her hands even when 3 alarms are sounding simultaneously. At 2:33 p.m., as Megan is documenting Marcus's post-op recovery, vitals stable, consciousness returning, daughters crying with relief in the corner of the room, Dr. Pierce appears in the ICU doorway. He's tall in the way of men who've never had to make themselves small, silver-haired in the way of men who've inherited their confidence along with their surnames. He watches her for exactly 7 seconds. Long enough to notice. Not long enough to understand. Then he turns and walks away, his shoes echoing across the tile floor with the sound of something breaking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment later when Megan realized that somewhere in his eyes, a calculation had been made. Somewhere in the precise architecture of his mind, a threat had been identified. And threats, in Dr. Pierce's world, were always handled the same way, with systematic precision and absolute ruthlessness. She just didn't know it yet. Dr. Pierce stood beside Samuel Ortiz's bed during morning rounds, his presence filling the room like a tank idling in a garage, all power and barely contained aggression. Samuel lay propped on pillows, his daughter Maria sitting rigid in the vinyl chair, her arms crossed as if bracing for impact. Pierce didn't look at Megan when he spoke. He never did when he wanted to wound. "This nurse," he said, gesturing with 2 fingers like flicking away ash, "administered an incorrect dosage yesterday. Potassium chloride. Wrong concentration." He turned to Maria with practiced concern, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for concerned family members. "We caught it. Corrected it immediately. Your father is stable. But I wanted you aware of the protocol deviation." Maria's face hardened. Her jaw clenched. She looked at Megan for the first time, and in that look was everything: distrust, anger, the question of whether her father's life had been in the hands of someone incompetent. Megan stood 3 feet from the bed, hands clasped in front of her scrubs, her face absolutely neutral. Composure like a locked door. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a single muscle twitch that only someone trained to read stress responses would catch. She couldn't defend herself. If she spoke, if she said that she'd actually pulled up Pierce's orders yesterday afternoon and caught his mistake before it reached the fall line, that his dosage would have sent Samuel's potassium levels into cardiac arrhythmia territory, that she'd quietly corrected it and flagged it in the digital system with a note about the attending physician review recommended, if she said any of that, she'd be admitting she'd accessed his orders, scrutinized his work, found him lacking. She'd be confirming everything he was building in that termination file. Samuel watched her face. His hands, scarred and weathered from decades of labor, tightened on the blanket. His eyes moved from Maria to Megan and back, reading something in the silence that the others were missing. He said nothing. Veterans understood silence. They understood the difference between a person who was guilty and a person who was being made guilty by proximity to lies. Pierce continued his rounds with theatrical concern, adjusting Samuel's explaining the day's monitoring schedule, acting like a man who'd just saved a patient's life instead of nearly ended one. He left the room without acknowledging Megan beyond a single glance, the kind a man gives a broken piece of equipment he's already decided to discard. The room exhaled when he left. Samuel reached out, his hand finding Megan's for just a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with years and gratitude. She squeezed his hand once and left before Maria could ask questions. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour later, Megan entered the break room with her packed lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee she'd made at home because the hospital coffee tasted like it had been brewed through a mop. The room held the usual afternoon silence, the smell of microwaved leftovers and burnt coffee hanging in the air like a warning. 3 nurses sat at the far table, Sharon, Beth, and Linda, all scrolling through their phones with the practiced disengagement of people who'd already moved on to the next shift. Megan sat at the corner table where she always ate alone, unwrapping her sandwich with steady hands. The 3 nurses moved within seconds. Synchronized. Choreographed. Sharon grabbed her coffee cup, the gesture sharp enough to draw attention. Beth stood, gathering her phone and keys. Linda followed without looking at Megan, though her lips moved in that way that said whisper traveling at full volume. "I'm not sitting with someone who can't follow basic protocols," Sharon said, loud enough to reach the hallway. The words landed like shrapnel. They left. All 3 of them, their departure creating a vacuum that the rest of the break room seemed to absorb. Megan sat alone with her sandwich still in her hands, her appetite gone but her expression unchanged. She rewrapped the sandwich slowly, carefully, the way she'd been trained to handle sensitive equipment, with precision and control. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But inside, in that locked compartment where she kept her operational focus, something fractured. She ate the sandwich anyway. Every bite a choice. Every swallow a decision not to care what they thought. At 2 o'clock, Pierce posted the formal warning on the unit board where all staff rotations and notices were displayed. Bright yellow paper. A form titled Disciplinary Action, O'Brien, M. The words were perfect, sterile, and absolutely damning, failure to follow chain of command. Concerning judgment patterns. Requires immediate review and retraining. He used magnets to pin its center height where every nurse, doctor, and aide would see it during shift changes. A public execution delivered in triplicate with bureaucratic precision. Megan read it once while checking the rotation schedule for the evening shift. Her eyes tracked the words without absorbing them, the way a machine processes data without understanding context. She nodded, a single dip of her chin, barely visible, and returned to checking vitals on her patient rounds, her movements mechanical and perfect. But 7 minutes later, alone in the supply closet restocking bandages, her hands finally shook. Not fear. Never fear. The trembling came from something else entirely, the controlled fury of someone who understood exactly what was happening and exactly how systematic it was. Pierce had been building this file for 2 weeks. She knew the precise moment he'd turned, the afternoon she'd pulled up the billing screens looking for discharge summaries and seen his codes instead. Phantom procedures on uninsured patients. Procedure codes that didn't match any actual work. The kind of thing that triggered federal investigations if the wrong person saw it. The kind of thing that required removal of the person who'd seen it. She leaned against the metal shelving, eyes closed, for exactly 5 seconds. Her hands trembled against the cool stainless steel. 5 seconds. That's all she allowed herself. Then her breathing reset, her hands steadied, and when she stepped back into the hallway, she moved like nothing had happened. But something had shifted. Pierce wasn't just trying to fire her anymore. He was trying to bury her, and the efficiency of his approach suggested he'd done this before. The documentation was too clean, the timing too calculated, the social isolation too complete. This was a man who understood how institutions worked, how paperwork could justify anything if the narrative was constructed carefully enough. What happened next changed the terms of her entire assignment. An older veteran named Marcus Webb arrived for minor gallbladder surgery prep in the early evening. He was maybe 60, maybe more, the kind of weather that comes from 30 years of hard living and harder choices. Megan inserted his full line during pre-op, her movements efficient and precise, the needle entering at a specific angle, shallow approach, combat fast entry, minimal tissue trauma. It was the technique she'd learned in field medicine courses, refined in actual combat conditions, something you couldn't forget even if you wanted to. Marcus's eyes widened mid-insertion. He stayed perfectly still until she finished taping the line in place, his gaze locked on her hands. Then he whispered, his voice barely above breath, "That's a bagram entry angle. That's field medicine. You were a combat medic." Megan's face didn't change. She met his eyes for half a second too long, long enough for recognition to pass between them, short enough to plausibly deny it. "I trained in urgent care settings," she said neutrally, deploying the cover story she'd maintained for 3 months, the lie she'd practiced until it felt like truth. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he didn't believe a word of it. But something in his face shifted, respect, maybe, or recognition of the boundaries she'd just set. Veterans understood deflection. They understood when another veteran was choosing silence. "Lot of us end up in hospitals after," he said carefully, adjusting his pillows. "Different kind of service." She adjusted his forebag without responding, but something passed between them in that silence, the kind of understanding that transcends words, the kind that only people who've held lives together in combat zones could fully comprehend. She charted his vitals, documented his pre-op status, and left him to pre-surgical sleep. 20 minutes later, Pierce intercepted her in the hallway outside the medication room. His voice was surgical precision wrapped in false courtesy. "I notice you've been accessing patient billing records outside your care assignments," he said. "Not a question. A statement of known fact. That's a HIPAA concern, O'Brien. I'll need a written explanation by end of shift." She knew what this was. A trap being sprung. He was closing the net, tightening the narrative, creating the paper trail that would justify whatever came next. She knew her DOD monitoring mission, tracking medical supply theft, funneling equipment to overseas black markets, with Samuel Ortiz as the key witness, was now compromised by her visibility. 1 week ago she'd been invisible. Now she was a problem that required removal. Understood, she said. 5 words. No inflection. That night, from her studio apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, she sent an encrypted email to her handler, cover integrity at 40%. Recommend extraction protocol. The message deleted automatically after transmission, leaving no trace except in the minds of people trained to remember everything. The reply came in 4 words, mission critical. Maintain position. She deleted the message thread and stood at her kitchen window, watching rain hammer the street below. Her apartment held almost no personal items, a table, a chair, a bed, the basic furniture of someone passing through. On the single shelf above her desk sat a photograph in a frame, the only decoration she allowed herself. 12 faces in desert camouflage, 3rd Surgical Team from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Names she couldn't think about without the tremor returning to her hands. She didn't look at the photograph for long. The reassignment order came through email at 6:38 a.m., before Megan's shift even started. She was sitting in her apartment on Olive Street, coffee cooling in a ceramic mug, when her work phone buzzed. The subject line, Patient Care Adjustment, Room for 07. Pierce's signature block carried the weight of institutional authority, Dr. Marcus Pierce, Chief of Medicine. Below his name, the words hit like a tactical briefing, effective immediately. Samuel Ortiz will receive primary care coordination from Dr. Patel's nursing team. Nurse O'Brien is not to provide direct care to this patient pending administrative review. This decision reflects our commitment to ensuring optimal patient outcomes during periods of staff performance evaluation. The email had been forwarded hospital-wide. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood what it meant. Megan read it twice. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished her coffee, the taste metallic, clinical. The strategic brilliance of it registered first, the part of her trained in operational planning, in threat assessment. Pierce wasn't just isolating her from Samuel. He was isolating her from the entire DOD investigation. Samuel Ortiz had witnessed the loading dock transfer 3 weeks ago, the one Megan had documented in her encrypted logs, 2:14 a.m., Thursday night, 6 cardboard boxes marked Surgical Supply, St. Jude's Memorial, loaded into a white panel van with commercial plates that traced back to Apex Logistics, a shell company Megan had connected to 3 overseas black market brokers operating out of Istanbul and Sao Paulo. Samuel was the only hospital employee who could corroborate the timing. Now Samuel wasn't supposed to talk to her. Wasn't supposed to see her. Wasn't supposed to remember that she existed. The tremor didn't reach her hands. She'd trained against tremors for 23 years. But it lived somewhere beneath her ribs, a hollow recognition, the mission was collapsing. The Pentagon didn't care about Megan O'Brien, the undercover nurse. The Pentagon cared about a chain of evidence. And Pierce had just cut the chain in half with a single email. She arrived at Seattle General at 6:58 a.m., 8 minutes before shift briefing. The parking garage smelled of diesel exhaust and wet concrete. It had rained overnight, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that fell without drama, just steady and relentless. Her boots left wet prints on the tile as she walked through the ER entrance. At the nursing station, 3 colleagues were discussing the reassignment, voices pitched low but not low enough. Probably performance issues. Administrative stuff. Better that way. They stopped talking when she walked past. The silence that followed was like a door closing. Room for 07 was empty when she checked. Samuel had been moved to the orthopedic floor, room for 18, under Dr. Patel's care. A smaller room. A different wing. Unreachable. The bed linens were fresh, hospital issue, unmarked. Someone else's patient now. Patricia Simmons, the HR director, called her into a formal meeting at 1:27 p.m. The office was on the third floor, administrative wing, with a kind of carpet that muffled footsteps and windows that overlooked the city toward the sound. Patricia was a woman in her mid-50s, grey hair pulled into a tight bun, the kind of expression that suggested she'd had this conversation many times before and would have it many times again. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't smile. She opened a folder marked O'Brien, M. Personnel file and slid it across the desk so Megan could see the tabs, incident reports, protocol violations, family complaints, HIPAA concerns. Dr. Pierce has filed significant documentation regarding your performance over the past 2 weeks, Patricia said. Her voice was professionally sympathetic, the kind of tone that dissolved all personal accountability into institutional process. I'm sure you understand that we take patient safety extremely seriously. The allegations here. What allegations? Megan's voice didn't change. Neutral. Compliant. A nurse defending herself, not a tactical officer assessing an interrogation. Patricia's pen tapped once against the desk. The failure to follow chain of command on room 407. The incident with Dr. Pierce regarding medication protocols. The HIPAA violation he reported 3 days ago. And we have received 3 separate family complaint forms regarding your bedside manner. 3 separate forms. Fabricated entirely. Megan had checked the complaint system herself. Pierce had access to patient family contact information, rosters, everything he needed to make convincing calls. My apologies, Megan said. I want to clarify the room 407 situation. That's actually why I called this meeting. Patricia removed a memo from the folder. 1 page, single-spaced. We're scheduling a formal termination hearing for Friday at 2 p.m. Before that hearing, you're being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and parking pass. You're not to enter the hospital without prior written permission from HR. These are standard protocols in cases of serious performance concerns. Friday. 3 days. Megan read the memo without touching it. The language was precise, institutional, unassailable. Pending administrative review. Allegations of patient endangerment. Failure to maintain professional standards. Investigation by hospital legal. I understand this is difficult, Patricia continued, and she actually sounded like she meant it. But when patient safety is at question, we have to err on the side of caution. Dr. Pierce feels. Dr. Pierce, Megan said carefully, has something to gain from my removal. Patricia's expression shifted, just barely. A flicker of something, maybe recognition, maybe caution. What do you mean? Megan chose her words like she was selecting surgical instruments. He's very invested in this outcome. I wonder if that's coincidental. She watched Patricia's face carefully. The woman was competent, careful, bound by institutional process. She wasn't corrupt. But she was also the one enforcing the system Pierce had weaponized. I'd like to request an independent investigation. That's noted, Patricia said, already closing the folder. Your opportunity to present your side will come Friday at the hearing. You're welcome to bring representation. Union rep, attorney, whoever you'd like. But until then, she held out an envelope. Your personal effects from your locker are here. You'll need to clear them today. The walk from Patricia's office to her locker took 7 minutes. Past the break room where 3 nurses were sitting. Past the supply closet where she'd reorganized a 400-unit inventory of syringes 2 weeks ago. Past the medication dispensary where she'd caught Dr. Patel's daughter stealing OxyContin for her boyfriend and had reported it quietly, through channels, because that's what Captain Megan O'Brien did. She followed protocol. She maintained professionalism. She was the kind of person who sacrificed herself to the institution because she believed in it. The locker was on the 4th floor, in the staff locker room at the far end of the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Her magnetic nameplate was still on the door. M. the Brian, R.N. She opened it and found everything exactly as she'd left it, extra scrubs folded in thirds, a pair of compression socks, the small laminated photo of her parents from 1994, her mother in a sundress, her father in his navy dress blues, both of them impossibly young, impossibly alive. She touched the photo once, then placed it in the envelope Patricia had given her. At the bottom of the locker, beneath the scrubs, was the jacket. The one she'd worn during her last 2 deployments. The fabric was dark olive, faded by sun and sand and things she didn't let herself think about in daytime. Inside the lining, sewn tight enough that airport security never detected it, was the unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The patch showed the silhouette of a black horse against a red background, simple and impossible to fake. She never wore it. Never showed it. Never mentioned it. But knowing it was there, that was the difference between being a nurse named Megan and being Captain O'Brien of the Joint Special Operations Command's intelligence apparatus. She pulled the jacket out and held it folded against her chest, the cloth still faintly cool from the air conditioning. A younger nurse, someone Megan recognized from intake, walked past and deliberately looked away. The ostracism was accelerating. Within 2 days, no one would speak to her at all. By Friday, she'd be a ghost. The mission was failing. Megan O'Brien's undercover operation, 3 months of building trust, documenting evidence, protecting Samuel Ortiz as he prepared to testify before a federal grand jury about the equipment trafficking, that was all collapsing because Dr. Marcus Pierce had decided his profit margin was more important than her cover. She left Seattle General at 2:51 p.m., badge and parking pass surrendered, personal locker empty. The October rain had started again, heavier now, the kind that hammered against the windshield like it had something to prove. She drove through the city without a destination, autopilot carrying her south on Interstate 5, past the industrial areas where the warehouses clustered. Her secure phone buzzed at 3:15. A message from an unknown number, status update requested. DOD needs timeline on surgical equipment recovery before week's end. The Pentagon. Closing in. Expecting results. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not until she understood what Pierce was doing with the equipment he was moving. The loading dock transfers had been weekly, always at night, always different vehicles. The surgical kits, specifically 14-gauge angiocath needles, suture materials, for administration sets, the kind of equipment that looked innocuous until he realized someone was building field surgical capacity offshore. Black market trauma response. Which meant someone overseas was expecting combat casualties. Which meant something larger than simple medical equipment theft. At 5:08 p.m., alone in her car in the parking lot of a Safeway she'd never been to before, Megan opened her encrypted laptop and accessed the DOD database she wasn't supposed to have. The surgical equipment shipments matched known JSOC supply requests. 3 months of redirected surgical kits traced back to a private military contract company operating in Yemen. Yemen. Which meant ISIS-affiliate fighters. Which meant someone in the Seattle General supply chain was arming a conflict zone through misdirected medical equipment. And Pierce knew. He'd been profiting from it. And he'd just suspended her before she could document enough evidence to take him down. The tremor came then, finally, in the privacy of her car. Just once. Her hand against the steering wheel. A single moment of something that looked like emotion but was actually adrenaline refusing to metabolize, combat readiness without a target. She controlled it. She breathed. She started the car and drove back toward the city, toward Pierce's address on 4th Avenue, toward the loading dock that operated every Thursday night at 2:14 a.m. If the Pentagon wanted results, Captain O'Brien was going to deliver them, with or without her hospital badge, with or without her career, with or without the permission of institutional process. She had 3 days before Friday's termination hearing. 3 days to prove Pierce guilty. 3 days to save Samuel. 3 days to decide whether her orders were to vanish quietly or to burn it all down. She knew which one she'd choose. The code alarm screamed at 6:19 p.m. on a Wednesday, that dead zone between shift changes when the ICU ran on fumes and prayers. Megan was passing room for 07 despite the reassignment, despite Pierce's email burning in her inbox like a warning flare when she heard it, not the alarm itself, but the particular pitch of the monitor going frantic. She glanced through the doorway. Samuel Ortiz's chest was hyperinflating asymmetrically, the skin between his ribs drawing inward like someone was vacuuming his lungs from the inside. His trachea had deviated left, a ridge of cartilage visible where it shouldn't be. His oxygen saturation was 94%. Then 89. Then 78. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space with nowhere to go, collapsing his lung and shifting his heart like a fist clenching around his mediastinum. She moved without thinking. The code button went off, but the responding resident was 3 floors away with a bleed in the ICU that wouldn't stop. The nurses at the desk were frozen, waiting for a doctor who wasn't coming. Samuel's lips were turning the color of a bruise. Megan had maybe 90 seconds before brain damage started. Maybe 4 minutes before death. Pierce's voice echoed in her skull, "You are not to provide care to this patient." Hospital Protocol HC 47B, nurses do not perform invasive procedures without physician supervision. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. The plastic wrapper crinkled like a gunshot in her hands. She didn't run to Samuel's bedside, she walked, her movements precise, her breathing steady. Muscle memory took over. She tore open his gown, palpated his second intercostal space, found the ridge of his ribs. The midclavicular line. The spot between second and third rib where the needle would go. Her fingers knew the anatomy. Her hands had done this before, at Forward Operating Base Delta under mortar fire, in a cargo helicopter with a Marine whose femoral artery was opening like a faucet, in a surgical tent where the only instruments were what she could improvise from field kits and desperation. She drove the needle in. The hiss of trapped air escaping filled the room like a sigh of relief. His chest wall decompressed. The trachea shifted back to midline. The monitor beeped, oxygen saturation climbing. 82, 87. 92, Samuel's eyes opened, confused but alive, his deaf eyes meeting hers with a question she couldn't answer in his language. The whole procedure took 18 seconds. Dr. Pierce appeared 6 minutes later. He came through the ICU doors with the resident trailing behind him, both of them moving toward room 407. Pierce's face went purple, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth made an audible sound. He looked at Samuel breathing steadily on the monitor. He looked at the decompression needle still in place. He looked at Megan standing beside the bed with her hands at her sides, her expression blank as a surgical mask. "What did you do?" Each word came out separate and vicious, the voice of a man watching his world reorganize into something he couldn't control. Megan's voice was steady, clinical, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, tension pneumothorax. Immediate decompression required. No physician was available. Pierce's face shifted. The purple deepened. His voice didn't raise, it exploded, loud enough to be heard throughout the ICU, loud enough that nurses paused at their stations and visitors looked up from bedside chairs. "You violated Hospital Protocol HC 47B. You performed an invasive procedure without supervision. You were explicitly removed from this patient's care." He turned to Samuel's daughter, who had stood up from the visitor's chair, her hand moving to her mouth. Pierce's voice took on the soothing tone of a man absolving himself of responsibility. "I am so sorry you witnessed this dangerous breach of protocol. This nurse acted without authorization. We will be investigating." Samuel was watching Pierce's mouth move. His fingers began signing, rapid and furious, his whole body shaking with something that wasn't fear. He was laughing. Actually laughing, his shoulders shaking with silent mirth while Pierce continued speaking into the void of his own rage. Megan didn't watch Pierce's breakdown. She already knew what came next. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand moved instinctively toward his pocket. By end of shift, security would be at her locker. By end of shift, her badge would be gone. By end of shift, 3 months of deep cover would be shredded like tissue paper. At 6:58 p.m., Dr. Pierce filed emergency suspension paperwork. It was already prepared in triplicate. He must have been carrying it since Tuesday, waiting for this exact moment, waiting for her to break protocol, waiting for her to prove herself unstable, waiting for the one moment when her choice to save a life would become his tool to destroy hers. He signed each copy with vicious precision, his handwriting leaving indents in the paper beneath. Immediate threat to patient safety. Willful insubordination. Grounds for immediate termination pending investigation. Security arrived at 7:12 p.m. 2 officers, both looking uncomfortable, both clearly instructed not to make eye contact with her. Megan stood at her locker and removed her belongings with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Badge first. Access card second. Hospital ID third. She folded her scrubs, the ones with the faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining, the patch that was the only physical reminder that Captain Megan O'Brien had ever existed, and placed them in her hands. "We need to escort you to the laundry room," one of the officers said quietly. "Hospital property has to be returned in person." Of course it did. Pierce would make sure of that. He would make sure every indignity had a formal procedure. The basement laundry room was pale green and hummed with the sound of industrial washers. Megan stood alone among the folding tables, holding her scrubs, the faded unit patch visible inside the jacket lining. The fabric felt like surrender. The patch showed a black silhouette against a white background, a bird in flight, or maybe an angel, or maybe just a symbol that meant something to people who had earned the right to understand it. She folded each piece carefully. Top first. Sleeves tucked. Bottom. The patch disappeared into the creases of the jacket, hidden again, just like it had been for 3 months. Just like it would be forever now, probably. When you blew up your own assignment from the inside, there was no coming back. No recovery. No second chance. The DoD investigation was collapsing in real time. Samuel Ortiz, the deaf veteran whose testimony was supposed to anchor the entire supply theft case, would be reassigned to another hospital. The equipment trafficking network would disappear back into the shadows, continuing its work, continuing to move contraband medical supplies to conflict zones in Yemen where they would end up in field hospitals treating insurgent fighters. 3 months of surveillance, 3 months of maintaining her cover as a hospital nurse, 3 months of enduring Pierce's systematic humiliation, all gone in 18 seconds because she had chosen to save a man's life instead of following protocol. She heard the alarms before security could escort her upstairs. New codes, different floor, different kind of emergency. The sound of a helicopter echoing above the hospital. The kind of noise that meant something was happening that didn't follow normal procedures. She kept folding her scrubs anyway. There was nothing she could do now. Her mission was over. Her cover was blown. Her connection to Samuel Ortiz was severed, and with it, the thread that connected everything else. In a few hours, she would drive back to Denver. She would find a new identity, a new job, a new way to disappear. The Pentagon would process her report and file it away, and someone else would be assigned to monitor the supply theft ring. Someone less careful. Someone who didn't understand what was really at stake. 2 days later, Friday afternoon, the basement laundry room would become the center of a scene that would end Dr. Pierce's career. But Megan didn't know that yet. She just knew her hands were steady, her breathing was controlled, and the weight of the folded scrubs in her arms felt like the only truth she had left. The last thing she did before leaving was place the hospital uniforms on the processing cart. Each piece folded. Each patch hidden. The fluorescent lights above her hummed their endless fluorescent hymn, indifferent to the collapse of one woman's entire world, and somewhere above her, emergency sirens were screaming about something she was no longer authorized to address. The refrigerated doors of the ICU hissed open at 2 in the morning, and with them came a sound that made every monitor in the unit seem to pause. The medical helicopter had landed 17 minutes ago. The patient came in on a stretcher still smoking, literally smoking, surrounded by a fusion of military personnel and civilian emergency crews who moved with the synchronized precision of people who'd done this before in places where the distinction between civilian hospital and war zone had never quite existed. Shrapnel wounds. Chest, abdomen, left shoulder. The refugee had been in a marketplace in Kandahar when the device detonated, caught in the periphery of violence that was supposed to be 3,000 miles away from anyone who would recognize the way a trauma surgeon moved. Megan was checking the 4-drip on a post-op patient when the commotion reached her section of the unit. She didn't look up immediately, that was protocol, the quiet nurse checking vitals, invisible, but the sound that came next made her hand still on the 4 line. Not screaming. Something older than that. A voice in Pashto, raw and fractured, the words tumbling over each other like someone trying to remember a prayer after decades of forgetting. Jinn. Jinn. The angel of Bagram. The angel of Bagram is here. The refugee patient's eyes locked onto hers across the room. His body convulsed upward against the restraints they'd placed for his own safety, his right hand straining toward her, his voice cracking on every syllable. The medical team froze for half a second. That's all it took, the moment of recognition rippling through the ICU like electricity through copper wire. The monitors around him went haywire. Heart rate climbing. 142, 156. The kind of spike that happened when a human body suddenly remembered something the brain had been trying to forget. Dr. Pierce appeared, his voice slicing through the chaos like a scalpel. Who let this man see anyone? This patient needs complete isolation. I want that nurse removed from the unit immediately. He pointed at her without looking at her face, the gesture of a man erasing someone from a room using only the architecture of his contempt. Now. That's an order. The 2 security guards flanking the bed shifted weight, preparing to move, but Samuel Ortiz, the deaf veteran 3 beds down, the one everyone called difficult, the one Pierce had reassigned away from her care 6 months ago, was already reaching for his whiteboard. His marker moved with deliberate precision. The guards hesitated. In a hospital, everyone learned to read Samuel's whiteboard. It was how he communicated what nobody else could hear. That call sign was on the medevac manifest that saved my platoon. The words on the whiteboard stopped every person in the room except Dr. Pierce, whose face had gone the color of old paper. Samuel held the board higher. His eyes met Megan's, and something passed between them that needed no translation, the recognition of people who'd been written off by someone and lived to make him regret it. A voice cut through the tension from the corridor. Not a yell. Something worse than that. Something that carried the weight of authority the way steel carries weight. Stand down, Pierce. That's my order, not yours. The man in the navy dress uniform came through the doors with the kind of presence that made the ICU fluorescent lights seem to hum at a different frequency. Behind him was another figure, taller, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where decisions became policy, policy became doctrine, doctrine became the rules that governed who lived and who died. A Marine Corps liaison and a 2-star general. The kind of arrival that made the air in a room reorganize itself. The liaison carried a tablet. His voice, when he spoke, resonated like he'd been waiting to say these words for a very long time. Captain Megan O'Brien. Silver Star citation, classified until 48 hours ago when the Pentagon declassified these records due to material relevance to an ongoing federal investigation. He read from the screen, his eye scanning each sentence as if he were speaking directly to history itself. Led a surgical team under direct fire for 18 hours, treating casualties during the siege of Jalabad. 43 lives. He paused. 43. Under direct fire. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but nothing came out except a sound like air leaking from a tire. The general stepped forward. He was older, with the kind of scars on his hands that came from decades of work that never ended, operational scars, intelligent scars, the physical evidence of bearing weight that ordinary people couldn't even imagine carrying. When he saluted, the gesture was so precise, so formal, that every person in the ICU felt the weight of protocol. Not theater. Not pageantry. The weight of recognition that transcends ranks and uniforms. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. He paused between each medal, letting the room absorb the words. And a Navy Cross. He let the final silence settle like snow. Pentagon intelligence confirms Captain O'Brien's codename Nightingale was instrumental in dismantling 3 enemy field hospitals that were operating in direct support of ISIS logistics. This woman has saved more lives in 12 months than most surgeons save in 12 years. Dr. Pierce's voice cracked when he tried to speak. General, with respect, hospital protocol supersedes military jurisdiction within these walls. I have documentation of multiple. He never finished. Jerry Chen appeared in the doorway like a ghost suddenly given form. The IT administrator who'd worked quietly in the basement server room for 7 years, the Army vet who'd been flagging suspicious deletion attempts since week 4, the man nobody had ever really noticed because nobody ever looked at the people who fixed the technology rather than using it. He carried a laptop, and his voice, when it came, was flat with the kind of certainty that comes from evidence. Funny thing about documentation, Dr. Pierce. You tried to delete 14 separate security recordings from the loading dock over the past 6 weeks. I saved every frame. Jerry turned the laptop around. The screen showed Dr. Pierce, his face unmistakable, supervising the transfer of surgical equipment into unmarked vans at 3:15 in the morning. The medical grade for pumps. The portable ventilators. The trauma packs that cost $1,700 each, the same packs listed in hospital records as damaged or expired. Same equipment was transported to Yemen through a medical supply broker with ties to black market arms dealers. FBI's been tracking it for 14 months. A woman in a grey suit appeared with hospital security and a man whose ID badge read legal counsel. Patricia Simmons, HR director, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to end a career. We've been contacted by federal investigators regarding irregularities in your billing practices. Phantom procedures on uninsured patients specifically. Charges that inflated costs by 40 to 60% per patient. She pulled out a folder thick with documentation. The margin between what you billed and what was actually performed funded the equipment transfers. Pierce's face cycled through emotions like a broken film projector: denial, rage, calculation, denial again. His hands trembled as he tried to organize a response, the bureaucratic armor finally cracking like old paint. I want my union representative. The words came out smaller each time he tried to repeat them. I want representation. The general stepped closer, not threatening, just occupying space. You have rights. You also have consequences. You systematically harassed and attempted to terminate a decorated Special Forces officer conducting a federal investigation. That investigation now has sufficient evidence to prosecute the supply theft ring you've been operating. That's conspiracy. That's trafficking. That's selling medical equipment to entities that used those supplies to support insurgent operations. Samuel Ortiz held up his whiteboard again. A single sentence. I saw everything. Told Captain O'Brien 2 months ago. The refugee patient, stabilized now, his breathing more controlled, gestured toward Samuel with his less damaged arm. A translator appeared, one of the military personnel, and the refugee's voice came through translated Pashto, those supplies. American medical equipment. Treated the fighters who killed my family. I recognized the packaging. Pierce's exit from the ICU was silent except for his shoes on the tile floor, the sound like an erasure. Security escorted him toward the administrative offices, not roughly, just with the inexorable finality of a decision already made. But before they reached the doors, Megan spoke for the first time since the general arrived. Her voice was quiet and absolutely level, each word measured like a surgical dose. The phantom billings funded the equipment theft. You inflated charges on patients who couldn't fight back to finance selling supplies to black market brokers. And when I got close, you tried to destroy me with paperwork. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence that happens when someone finally speaks the truth out loud and the world adjusts itself around it. Pierce didn't turn around. He just kept walking, smaller with every step. 6 months later, Megan stood in her new office at Seattle General, room 407, where the deaf veteran had been admitted the day everything collapsed, and watched through the glass partition as Samuel Ortiz was being discharged. His daughter pushed his wheelchair toward the exit, both of them smiling the way people smile when they've survived something that was supposed to end differently. The Seattle Times headline was framed on Megan's desk: "Former Seattle General Chief of Surgery sentenced in medical supply theft scheme." Dr. Pierce was teaching CPR to bored community college students in a strip mall classroom 30 miles away, $15 an hour, his medical license suspended pending the completion of his fraud trial. Megan had been officially appointed as Veterans Affairs Hospital Liaison for Seattle General, a position created specifically for her after the investigation concluded. Jerry Chen had installed a private server in her office. Marcus Webb, the older veteran who'd recognized her bagram technique, visited weekly with other vets who needed someone who understood. The refugee patient, now granted asylum, worked as a community health interpreter 3 blocks from the hospital and stopped by every Tuesday with chai tea and broken English gratitude. Samuel's daughter leaned down and translated his signs as he looked back one final time at Megan standing in the doorway of room 407. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd learned to speak in silence. "Thank you for being too stubborn to give up on a deaf veteran everyone else found too difficult." The faded unit patch that had been sewn inside Megan's jacket lining for 12 years was now framed on her office wall, mounted beside her Silver Star citation and a photograph of her surgical team from Bagram, the faces she could finally look at without her hands shaking. Morning light caught the frame at an angle that made the old fabric seem to glow, a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd become. She touched the glass lightly, the tremor in her hand finally, completely gone. General Vasquez had sent a handwritten note on official Pentagon letterhead: "The best operators never stop serving. Welcome home, Captain." If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your worth, please like this video and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear that true strength often wears a quiet face. And in the comments, tell us, what would you do if you had to choose between following orders and doing what's right? We read every comment, and we want to hear from you.